One sec, it looks like it's starting to setting up the webinar on YouTube. It shouldn't be this complicated. Okay, it's streaming now. You can maybe. Here's the link, Ryan. I'll send it to the Discord. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, we are live. Looks like the audio and everything should be working. Hopefully, David's audio will be working as well. Apologize for the technical stuff. There's issues regarding a live stream connection between Zoom and YouTube and all the pre-established sessions and all that stuff. So that we're dealing with, but thanks everyone for joining, and we're looking forward to getting the people that were in the other session moved over. They'll be here in a second, and we'll have a good cleaned up version of this recording available after the fact. So in our second session, we're very excited to welcome Dr. David Noe. David does a bunch of things. I believe this is still accurate. David, you still a Beza Scholar in Residence for Greek and Latin at Puritan. Is that still the case?
That's correct.
And also, David serves as the pastor of Reformation Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we're delighted to have him. He has lectured quite a bit extensively on Beza and Beza's theology. Weren't you just at a seminar? Was it back in
Westminster, California?
Yeah, back in January we caught up there. And we're looking forward to that. In our second session now, Dr. Noe will be presenting on Beza at the Colloquy of Poissy. We're excited to have you, David. I'll turn things over to you, and I'll keep an eye on the live chat as well. And maybe if there's some time at the end before breaking for lunch, we can entertain some questions. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Camden. Yes, very much. I only intend to speak for maybe 30 to 40 minutes. I plan to keep it relatively short, so I hope there is a lot of time for questions. So it's a privilege for me to join this panel of other scholars and to talk about one of my favorite theologians, namely Theodore Beza. Camden is now the historian for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and back in the day, I was on that particular committee with his predecessor, the less than distinguished John Meether. And at one of our meetings, we had a little bit of a debate. I was at the time working on this book, A Clear and Simple Treatise on the Lord's Supper, which is by Theodore Beza. I don't know if the viewers can see that. And I was trying to convince Mr. Meether and Reverend Ollinger and some others that of the reformers in the 16th century, Theodore Beza belonged in the top 5 in terms of the extent of his influence. Now, I won't say in polite company exactly how they responded to that claim, but let's just say they were not convinced. Clearly, everyone says Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, those 3, maybe Melanchthon. I can't really put Knox in that category because although he was important for Scotland, I don't think really anything he wrote was of universal interest in the 17th century. Beza, by contrast, had a profound impact on many, many things, not only consolidating Calvin's ideas theologically and his work in Geneva, but particularly on the composition, translation of the English version of the Bible, as Irena Bacchus has made abundantly clear. So many of the construals that we have in the English Bible and the King James Version and so forth are derived directly from the way that Beza understood particular passages, specifically in his 5 editions of the Annotationes in Novum Testamentum, his commentary on the New Testament, which continued to the end of his life, in fact, until 1595, if I'm not mistaken. So Beza, in sum, is an extremely important figure for the development and expansion of Reformed theology. And so what I intend to do today is a couple of different things. First, give the briefest of biographical histories of Theodore Beza to try to place him in its proper context. I say briefest, but it's likely as I warm to the subject that it'll end up not being so brief. Secondly, I want to talk about the Colloquy of Poissy, which took place in September of 1561, because it's a fascinating episode in the history of the Reformation, with long-term implications for Reformed churches today and our Eucharistic practice. And then the third point of my lecture is that I would like to talk a little bit about Beza's view of the supper specifically, and that is his notion of spiritual manducation. He says quite provocatively, you have to have two mouths in order to be a faithful Christian. You have to have a physical mouth in order to consume the bread and the wine, and you have to have a spiritual mouth so that you may consume Christ for your edification and salvation. And so that's going to come at the end of today's brief talk. So first then, Theodore Beza's biography. He was born in 1519 in Vézelay, France, and this places him as 10 years the junior of John Calvin. Beza was born into an upper middle class family, an aristocratic family. His mother died when he was a very young child, and he was sent to Paris to live with his uncle. And while he was in Paris, he began to receive an excellent literary education. Learning Latin, studying Greek eventually. When he was 6 or 7 years old, the exact age is not clear to me, but you can find all the details in this book if it can be seen. This is the standard biography in English by Henry Martin Baird. I understand that Dr. Klauber's colleague Scott Manich is soon intending to replace this, but for now this is a very reliable biography. He began to study under a German scholar named Melchior Wolmar, W-O-L-M-A-R. And Melchior Wolmar was arguably the best pedagogue in Europe. He is classed with such persons as Erasmus, who was not so much a pedagogue but a scholar, John Colet in England, as well as individuals like Juan Luis Vives and others for the strength of their pedagogical approach. Now, while he studied with Wolmar, he was receiving, and this would have been in the late 20s, early 30s, he was receiving not just a world-class literary education in matters of Greek and Latin, but he was being taught crypto-Lutheran views by Melchior Wolmar. For a while, he and Calvin were classmates, because although Calvin was 10 years his senior, their time under Melchior Wolmar coincided. So this is an interesting fact about the development of the Reformation. And they seem to have become friends when Calvin was perhaps nearing the age of 20 and Beza was around 10 years old. Beza had every advantage that Calvin did not, of birth, of finances. Baird makes clear that Beza could support himself on his family inheritance, as well as a number of different benefices that he had from churches in Paris. He soon distinguished himself as a young man of incredible ability in languages. So he was mastering the classical corpus in both Greek and Latin. Beza began to write poetry under Wolmar. And as I said, Wolmar seems to have been a crypto-evangelical. So the viewers probably know that in the early stages of the Reformation, if you were not in harmony with Rome, then you were called a Lutheran. There weren't the distinctions that we have now. Everyone at the time would have been Lutheranus, or in the plural, Lutherani. So when Erasmus and others argued against the positions of Luther, of Zwingli, and so forth, everyone was called a Lutheran, Lutherani, or Lutheranus in the singular. And so Beza was imbibing those views, but he wasn't openly professing them. Fast forward now to the time when Beza is in his 20s, in fact, to the year 1548. So in 1548, Beza would have been 29 years old. He's living in Paris, and he seems to be seeking a literary reputation. So the pattern for this were men like Guillaume Boudet, another very famous French humanist, and Jacques Lefebvre, who went by the Latin name Stapulensis. And so that was the pattern which Beza desired for himself. He wanted to be the next generation humanist along the lines of Erasmus. He wanted to be it seems, the French Erasmus. And he was very much in sync with what seemed to have been Calvin's early intentions along these same lines. The viewer might know that Calvin's early training was in law and humanities, much like Beza. Also like Beza, he did not have any desire for law, but was driven toward that occupation by his father and by his family interests. Calvin had literary aspirations. He famously wrote his commentary on Seneca's De Clementia, borrowed money from family and others to take it to press, and it was a colossal failure. There was nowhere near the interest in Calvin's ideas on Seneca as he had hoped. Now, Beza had a similar but not identical experience. He seems to have wanted to be a poet. And so in 1548, he published his Poemata, that is his collection of poems, which were later entitled the Juvenilia. And here is a copy. I don't know if you can see it too well. The focus isn't great, but this is a book called A View from the Palatine by Kirk Summers, the Juvenilia or Youthful Poems of Theodore Beza, Theodore de Beza. So there was quite an enthusiastic reception for Beza's poetry. He was a gifted poet in both French and Latin, and these early poems, as Summers explains, these early poems are noteworthy for their allusions to classical sources. He's showing off the extent of his learning, patterning himself after such Roman poets as Catullus and Tibullus and Propertius and Ovid and so forth, but also mingling into the poetry a fair bit of muted criticism of Roman Catholic practice. So there was a place in Paris called the Palatine. This was, a particular park. And Beza says in some of these poems that he likes to go to these places and people watch, and then he likes to compose poems as a study of human nature, the things that he has experienced. And of course, there's a reference and an allusion to the Palatine in the city of Rome itself, which was the home of these Roman poets. So Beza had this ambition. He was going to be a poet. He was going to join the ranks of the French greats like Ronsard and others, and he was going to make a name for himself in that way. But as Summers says, not only did these poems show his classical learning and his commentary on Parisian society, but there was muted criticism of Roman practice. So the point we want to trace is that Beza had not ever completely given up the crypto-Lutheran ideas he had inherited from Melchior Wolmar, as Wolmar taught him how to read the scriptures in the Greek language and was teaching him, so we think, Lutheran ideas. In 1548, he contracted a serious illness, and this illness was a turning point in his life. He presents it as a conversion. The Lord knocked him low, he said, and he was in danger of dying, he thought. He had always had a weak constitution. From childhood, he had not had very good health. And so in 1548, at the age of 29, he actually thought that he was going to die. And so on his deathbed, he pleaded with the Lord to rescue him, and seems to have made some kind of a pledge to come out as a Protestant and serve the Lord thereafter. So he recovered from that illness, and on that occasion, he decided to flee Paris then, along with his wife, Claudine de Nos. Now, he had been married to Claudine in a secret marriage, and I like what Summers says about this. He says that marriages at the time were not grand formal affairs unless you were in the high nobility. So you didn't send out invitations, months in advance and plan the refreshments and so forth. Many people got married in very simple settings, like in a pub or a tavern. You needed a couple of witnesses, you needed a priest who could perform the ceremony, and that would be that. So Beza had been married to Claudine de Nos for a couple of years, and this is an important fact for later, but it wasn't publicly known. So he and Claudine and a little bit of his money and books left Paris in 1548 and traveled to Geneva, where he was received by Calvin. He then went on to Lausanne, which is on the north coast, or the northern part of the Genevan Lake, where he met up with Pierre Viret, who was one of Calvin's associates and was teaching at the school there. And so Viret offered him a position as instructor of Greek at the Lausanne University. So Beza stayed there from 1548 until 1558, 59 as a professor of Greek. Now, one of the conditions for him to receive that position in Lausanne was that he had to address some of the questionable details of his earlier poetry. I'm relying here very much on Kirk Summers' work. Before the city council would grant him the post at the university, they wanted to know about some of his poetry that he had written. Now, Summers says they shouldn't really be called juvenilia or child adolescent kind of poems, because after all, Beza was 29 when he published them. So this was not kind of a youthful farce. It wasn't an ill-considered decision. It was something very deliberate on his part to make a name for himself, but also to subtly criticize Roman Catholic worship practice. However, in these poems, there are some indecent things that he says in imitation of the Roman love poet Catullus. The Roman love poet Catullus is a brilliant poet with many beautiful things to say, but some of his poetry is fairly lascivious. You know, it talks about passion for women, passion for men, and so forth. And in one particular poem, Beza imitated a Catullan poem in which he says he can't decide who is the dearer friend to him, a woman named Candida, who is his fictitious love interest, and a man named Adalbertus. And his opponents, his Roman opponents, seized on this and basically accused Beza of having disordered loves, of being homosexual. And in fact, they said that this is the reason why he had to flee Paris. They said he had to flee Paris because the Parliament had arraigned him on charges of sodomy. And so he had to leave in order to rescue his reputation and avoid prosecution. Now, this is all made up. It's not true. And Beza will later on, it is true that he wrote the poem, but it isn't true that there's anything indecent about it. It's just standard imitation. And only if you are reading it to find that kind of information will you notice it, I would say. Beza made a full apology. He said, I was young. I should have chosen my words differently. I'm not guilty of the charges alleged, but I wish I had been wiser in retrospect. This continued to be a charge leveled against him by opponents for the rest of his life. That and questions of his ordination, as with Calvin, because unlike men like Luther, who were already doctors in the church, and Zwingli, who was a priest, neither Beza nor Calvin had ever completed a theological course of instruction. It seems as though Calvin studied at the College of Montaigu briefly in Paris, where he may have encountered Ignatius Loyola, but neither of them had ever graduated from a theological program. They had never been ordained in the church, and they had no degrees to their name. So Beza and Calvin have a lot of similarities in that regard. One difference, however, is that Beza was a much more accomplished student of literature. Calvin, I would say, the better exegete on the whole, but Beza has an extremely refined sense of humane letters, what are called res humaniores. And Calvin, to his credit, recognized this. And after 10 years of Beza being in Lausanne, Calvin recruited him to come to Geneva and be the first rector of the Academia Genevensis, the Geneva Academy. And it's very interesting if you read through some of the preliminary documents that set up the Geneva Academy. One of the rules that the Geneva Academy has for their instructors is that they are not supposed to criticize the literature of the ancients in the first year or second year of study. So this notion of discernment, which makes up so much of, I would say, the Christian study of secular literature, was present at the Geneva Academy, but it was strictly forbidden in the early stages of the child's education. I say child, but the Geneva Academy was for, adolescent males primarily, men in their early teens who were preparing for ministry. But the professors were strictly forbidden from criticizing Plato, Cicero, Virgil, Livy, and so forth until the later stages of the student's education. And the idea was you can't properly criticize something unless you fully understand it. And they were very wary of having sort of nascent scholars leveling criticisms against the ancients. So Beza came in 1558, 1559, and began working at the academy. He soon joined the company of pastors along with Calvin. And then, of course, you may know that he took over that post after Calvin's death in 1564. He became the moderator of the company of pastors from 1564 until his death in 1605. So if you caught the first point that he was born in 1519, and you caught that last point, 1605, and if you can do the arithmetic, maybe you have to take your shoes off, you know that he lived for 86 years. 86 years. So he was 2 years old when the things began to erupt in Wittenberg in 1517. And in 1605, he is only 14 years away from the Synod of Dort. In fact, Arminius was one of his students briefly in Geneva. And at the Synod of Dort, Beza is one of the most quoted luminaries from the previous generation. Everyone at Westminster was reading Beza, his annotations on scripture, his confession of faith, some of his polemic treatises on the Lord's Supper. So one of the really unique things about Beza, and why I argued so strenuously against Camden's predecessor, Mr. Meether, was that Beza spans an enormous range of authors and persons. He knew Calvin personally. He knew Peter Martyr Vermigli. He corresponded with Melanchthon. He outlived Bullinger by 25 years, Heinrich Bullinger. He would not have met Zwingli, of course, but he knew men who knew Zwingli, right, personally and intimately. He was a contemporary, an early contemporary of some of these men, and yet he lived up into the 17th century. So this makes him a really unique figure in terms of amount of influence and the things that he experienced. In addition, I want to say just a couple of other things about his work as a poet and a literary figure before we start talking about Poissy. He was the first to write a biography of Calvin, the Vita Calvini, at the time of Calvin's death. And he had, of course, unparalleled access to Calvin's life and his archives. They were only in personal association for approximately 5.5 years, from 58, 59 until 1564, but had met him on two previous occasions, if you remember, before he went to Lausanne in 1548 and when they were children. And Beza always had the most remarkable reverence for Calvin's character and for Calvin's ability with Scripture. So these are two things that we may not think about in terms of Calvin. Those who don't know much about him perhaps have adopted some stereotypes. You know, his stridency about predestination, supposedly, and his willingness to engage in conflict with men like Servetus and Bolsec and others. And those things might be true, but it's interesting that Beza dwells on Calvin's character and has just obvious love for his predecessor and on his ability with Scripture, you know, praising him in ways that we might even think extreme because of his admiration for Calvin's ability. So not only did he write the Vita Calvini, but he contributed to some of the earliest drafts of a history of the French Reformation. He continued to publish poems into extreme old age, in Extremis Senectuta, and he wrote a series of portraits on reformers called the Icones. And this is quite an interesting literary production because he would write little elegiac couplets, these charming little Latin poems, and then he would couple it with an image, a wood carving or some other kind of image of one of these reformers, starting all the way back with Wycliffe and Huss, including Savonarola, the Florentine, Luther, Melanchthon, Ecolampadius, just pretty much everyone throughout that whole century. And these are a treasure trove of biographical information, as well as interest, because Beza is so adept as a poet. And he took that same sort of highly refined literary ability, he took that into the composition of theology. And I think that's a really important point. There's one very famous dialogue that he wrote against a German Lutheran named Heshusius or Hessus, and the title of it is Kreophagia, a Greek word that means flesh eater, Kreophagia, or meat eater. And Beza says, I'm going to entitle this the Kreophagia, and then the alternative title is Sive or Sive Kyklops, the meat eater or Cyclops. And in this dialogue that truth teller takes up with his Lutheran opponent on the supper, Beza is the one who is the truth teller, and Heshusius is speaking in propria persona, in his own person. And Beza adopts the notion of the Platonic dialogue or the Ciceronian philosophical dialogue in order to present polemic theology. And of course, the title itself is supposed to be, humorous and a zinger, right? What are Lutherans? They're like Polyphemus, the Cyclops who's trapped in that cave with Odysseus's men. And what is he doing? He's eating human flesh like a cannibal. Now, if we have any Lutheran viewers today, I'm very glad, and you can take umbrage to that if you'd like. My point is simply to show Beza was constantly using literary and poetic references to make his theological writing not only very accurate and precise because of his philological skill, but also interesting to others. Okay, so he remarried late in life, not as late as Farel remarried, by the way, but then died in 1605 in Geneva, always trying to get out of the position of moderator of the Company of Pastors, but never really succeeding. And as Summers says, his very old age was a burden to him. He kept asking, why does the Lord retain me here? My health is poor. I keep getting older and older. I can't do the kinds of things I wanted to do, but here I persist to the age of 86 in Geneva. In fact, there was one point where some of his Jesuit opponents wrongly spread the rumor that he was dead, and that on his deathbed he had recanted and pledged fealty to the Pope. So then Beza was obliged to write a letter in which he said, the reports of my demise are greatly exaggerated. This is me. This is I. This is my signature. I'm still very much alive. And of course, I haven't gone back to Rome. I believe everything I have always believed since the time of my conversion in 1548. Okay, so now on to Poissy. So Poissy is a little town that is approximately, my notes say, it is approximately 23 kilometers from the center of Paris. So it's about 15 miles from Paris. In the fall of 1561, the powers that be in the French monarchy, including Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, decided that she wanted to bring peace to the realm once and for all, and for there to be a cessation of hostilities between the Reformed, or the Lutherans, once again, as everybody is called, the Lutherani, and the Catholics in the realm. And so, with bills of safe passage, representatives of the Reformed position were invited to come to Poissy and to debate with their Roman opponents under the supervision of the court in order to settle this question once and for all. Calvin very much wanted to go, but the city council forbade him because it was a dangerous mission. It wasn't clear that he could return safely, even though they had safeguards from the royal family. Of course, it's possible that some zealot could disregard those safeguards and hope that the royal family would introduce a reward despite those safeguards. And so Calvin was forbidden to go. Beza went in his stead. which in hindsight was a very good choice because Beza, as all of the secondary sources say, was much better schooled in court etiquette. This was an area that was unfamiliar to Calvin. Of course, he could speak excellent French, as his native tongue, and he could speak excellent Latin, the language in which the debate would take place. But the niceties of court etiquette, those were entirely foreign to Calvin. So Beza was designated to go. September 9, 1561 is when the colloquy began, the Colloquium Poissy. But there was another very important figure who happened to be there September of 1561, and that is the Florentine Peter Martyr Vermigli. And the two of them represented the Reformed cause. And this is a very important point. So Vermigli was born in 1499 from Florence. He spent some time in Italy with many high-powered friends like Cardinal Pole and Cardinal Bembo. And it was while he was in Naples in 1539 that Vermigli began to preach in a openly Lutheran way. Specifically, he interpreted 1 Corinthians 3 as not a defense of purgatory. And that is the standard Roman proof text for purgatory, 1 Corinthians 3. You'll escape with your possessions, but as though through fire. And by reading Martin Bucer and Zwingli and others, Vermigli came to the conclusion 1 Corinthians 3 is not about purgatory. In fact, it's an indefensible position. And moreover, justification is by grace alone through faith. Of course, this made Vermigli susceptible to the Inquisition. And while he was living in Lucca, northern Italy, 1548, he received news. He was tipped off that his name was on the Inquisitor's list. And so he saddled up his horse with a couple of servants and a portion of his library, and he went over the Alps and he arrived in Strasbourg in fall of 1548. And Bucer welcomed him there. He then went to Zurich, to Oxford. But at this time, just a couple years before his death, actually just a year before his death in 1562, Vermigli was in Poissy with Theodore Beza. Now, I mentioned that little vignette of Vermigli's biography because when you hear that he's a Florentine, you know that he is a native Italian speaker. And of course, presiding over this entire affair was Catherine de' Medici, who was a native Italian, right? Who had married into the French royal family. And so the two of them were ideal representatives to defend the Protestant cause before the French aristocracy, Beza and Vermigli, respectively. And of course, the work for which Vermigli is most famous is his Oxford Disputation on the Sacrament. And after that was published, Calvin supposedly said, no one needs to write anything more about the Lord's Supper because Vermigli has, he's finished it once for all. This is the final word on the Lord's Supper. So let me read a little bit of Donald Nugent here from his work, Ecumenism in the Age of Reformation. There's a half a dozen different titles that I've been using to prepare this little lecture. And if any of our viewers want a bibliography, they can just contact me and I'll send them that, because I hope you'll read some of these books. They're quite interesting. So this is from Nugent, page 94. It was a distinguished company that on Tuesday, September 9, 1561, filed into the refectory of the old convent, the refectory is the cafeteria, of the old convent, at Poissy. Besides the royal family, the princes of the blood, and the council of state, there were 6 princes of the church, over 40 archbishops and bishops, 12 theologians of the Sorbonne, that of course is the school of theology in Paris, and as many canonists. Now, these were experts in canon law. For the Reformed, besides their party at court, in other words, there were Reformed sympathizers within the royal court, there were 12 ministers, including Beza and François de Morel, president of the First French National Synod, assisted by some 20 laymen. This official company has already been enumerated. Beyond them, there was a large and mixed group of curious spectators, including the poet Ronsard and the philosopher Peter Ramus. So that's the setting, September 9, 1561. And in the center of the Baird biography, there's a very nice, more or less contemporary illustration of what it looked like. I won't try to hold up the illustration to the camera because you won't be able to see it, but it's got a nice key, so it shows where everyone is sitting, where the king is, and the fact that the Protestants were required to stand. Although the royal family was keen on, let me see if I can find my note. The royal family was keen on this being a fair sort of disputation. Cardinal Lorraine, who was the main Roman representative, and Michel de l'Hôpital, they were not interested in treating the Protestants as equals. So for the first few days, there was a great deal of, I would say, diplomatic falderall about precisely how the Protestants should be treated. So let me see if I can find my reference here on this point. Well, you can read that on your own. But here from page 151 of Baird is one of Beza's opening statements. He said, "I am unpracticed in discussions of this kind, but you have heard what I would say. And you in like manner, returned Beza, have heard from me what should satisfy you. I sum all up thus. I summarize it all like this." So this is his statement. "The bread is the body of Christ sacramentally. That is, although that body, meaning the body of Christ, is today in heaven and nowhere else, yet the signs are with us upon the earth. Yet just so truly is that body given to us, and just so truly is it partaken of by us through faith, and that to life eternal because of God's promise, as the sign is naturally extended to our hands." So to explain that a little bit, it began on September 9. Within a few weeks, however, the Roman representatives, specifically Cardinal Lorraine and Michel de l'Hôpital, had attempted to turn the debate not into a debate about toleration and coexistence within France or about justification, but they were determined to turn the debate into a debate on the sacrament. And they did this for tactical reasons. They believed that if they could get the Protestants to say that the Mass was idolatry and should be abolished throughout the realm, that would be so offensive to the French aristocracy that the Protestants would be humiliated and receive no further audience. So it's very clear from Beza's correspondence with Calvin and from Peter Martyr Vermigli's historical account of the colloquy called the Relatio, that Beza was very reluctant to talk about the sacraments at all. He wanted to save that for another occasion. He said, this is not the time to debate Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper. But because of Lorraine's tactics, who was a very shrewd politician and a decent theologian, you might say, it only took a couple of days to draw the Protestants out so that they were quickly speaking not about these other matters that I mentioned, but they were debating only about the Lord's Supper. Let me just check my notes here. One of the moves that Cardinal Lorraine engaged in was to bring up the Augsburg Confession. So the Augsburg Confession, as you may remember, was drafted primarily by Philip Melanchthon, and there was a revision that was 1530. There was a revision much later, I think it was 1547, and this revision was signed by Calvin. So an early edition of the Augsburg Confession received Calvin's signature, his endorsement. And so Cardinal Lorraine, at one point during this colloquy in 1561, asked the Reformed, Beza and Vermigli primarily, if they would agree to sign the Augsburg Confession. This was not because Lorraine in any way endorsed the Augsburg Confession. He would have condemned it, and in fact the Council of Trent did condemn it, just as roundly as any Protestant view. But it was a tactic the idea was, well, here is kind of the middle position. And if you could at least sign the Augsburg Confession, you would be demonstrating, Beza said Lorraine in these sorts of words, you would be demonstrating your willingness to make peace in France. Because your views, which were wrongly understood as Zwinglian, your views are not something that's ever going to succeed in France. I would say that Beza and Vermigli, to their credit, did not compromise at that point, and in fact launched into a criticism of the Lutheran views on the Lord's Supper. One of the one of the things for which Beza was faulted in that particular colloquy, and which became an arguing point, is that he was wrongly charged with this particular slogan. And I'm going to give you the Latin and then I'll translate it. Beza supposedly said, according to Lorraine, Christus non magis est in coina, quam in coino, which means Christ is no more in the supper than he is in the dung of the barnyard. Beza never said anything so inflammatory, right? But because he does not believe in the physical presence of Christ within the elements, he could be charged with something like that, right? And this then became a slogan against which his Catholic opponents invade. They attacked him for that. As at all of these 16th, I'm about to wrap up here, as at all of these 16th century debates, the question was twofold, right? What do the scriptures say? And this is what the reformers were always trying to get their opponents back to. But secondly, what do the fathers say, right? Because Calvin famously said, Augustine is all ours. Augustinus totus noster est. This was his rejoinder to any kind of retreat to the fathers. Augustine is ours. He is on the Protestant side in matters of justification and in matters of the supper. Beza and Vermigli, very much the same way at the colloquy. When Lorraine and L'Hôpital and the other bishops, archbishops, they wanted to have recourse to the fathers, Beza sought to meet them on their own terms. One very interesting exchange is that Lorraine said, you are out of line, Beza, with the views of St. John Chrysostom, and cited a particular treatise. And Beza's response was, sir, I've read that treatise 18 times, and I have not once found in it the claim that you allege. So can you please show me where it is? We would say in modern terms, Beza said, show me the receipts, right? You can't just say that the fathers support the traditional view. You have to demonstrate it. And the same is true of Augustine. And so in this book, and then we'll conclude, in this book, which was my entry into the world of Beza, A Clear and Simple Treatise, the debate concerns largely Augustine, Cyprian, and Cyril of Alexandria. And the debate concerns whether or not Christ's physical body is circumscribed by time and space. The Greek word is aperigraptos, right? If Christ's physical body has no circumscription, that is, it's not bound to any time and place, then yes, Christ can be physically in the supper, and he can be seated at the right hand of the Father, which view is held by both transubstantiationists and the Gnesio-Lutheran consubstantiationists, but it is not the Reformed view. So, in other words, one's Christology and one's sacramentology are very closely united. You can never separate them. And Beza maintained from Augustine, Cyril, Cyprian, and many other fathers that Christ's physical body has a definite address. Now, spiritually, he fills all things. So he is spiritually present in the supper. And this is why he says, you must have two mouths in order to commune with Christ. Unbelievers commune only physically. Believers commune by eating bread and wine, which remain such, but they eat Christ spiritually. This is well reflected in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the language of not after a corporal or carnal manner, right? So oftentimes when these debates are mooted among Christians in the United States, some people will say, why don't you Reformed believe in a real presence? That's one of those things that makes my blood pressure go up really high. But there are so many of those I lose count. We do believe in a real presence. We just believe that the spiritual is more real than the physical or the carnal. Christ is really in the supper. In fact, Beza will say substantialiter. Christ is substantially in the supper. The substance of Christ is in the supper, both in the bread and the wine. How? Spiritually, because we believe in such a thing as a spiritual presence. The Roman rejoinder is, well, you're out of step with tradition. You don't have strong enough faith. The Lutheran rejoinder is often, you don't have enough faith to believe that this is truly Christ's body. And then the debate goes on that way. So maybe I'll conclude with these remarks and then open it up to questions. So Beza says there are 4 points that must be determined when it comes to the Lord's Supper. First of all, the nature of the signs. What is the nature of the signs? Secondly, what is the thing signified? Third, what is the conjunction of the thing or the things and the things signified? In other words, how are the signs and the things signified? How are they conjoined? If they are conjoined physically, then the Roman and the Lutheran view is correct. If they are conjoined spiritually, then only the Reformed view is correct. And if conjoined physically, then how does Christ have a body like we do? How is he like us in all things, yet without sin? And fourth, what is the participation of the believer in the signs and the things signified? And what is the participation, if any, of the unbeliever in this? And the very last comment then is relying on Luther and a much earlier disputant on the Lord's Supper named Berenger. Beza affirmed this, that we eat non dentes sed mentes. It's one of those little slogans. Slogans are really useful in theology because they capture people's imagination. And if they're erroneous, they're very destructive. But if they are accurate slogans, they're very useful. Beza said, we eat non dentes. It's not our teeth that eat, sed mentes, but it is our minds that eat. And he interpreted the passage in 1 Corinthians 11. What does it mean to discern Christ's body? It means to have a minimal knowledge of Christian doctrine. You have to have a bare minimum knowledge of Christian doctrine in order not to eat condemnation on yourself. So the practice in Geneva for someone who wanted to commune, and this is outlined in the back of this book, was the elders would take aside the candidate and they would ask him or her some basic questions, basically the Apostles' Creed. Do you have a basic understanding of the Christian faith? If so, you may commune. So that's the extent of my comments today. We have a little time for questions.
Sure. Thanks, David. That was wonderful. I guess maybe just to put a point on it for the listeners and myself, how would you summarize the product of the Colloquy of Poissy? What's the thumbnail,
right?
Encyclopedia entry. What came out of it? What benefit was it, if any?
Well, politically and socially, not much benefit. The wars of religion arose, and of course, Dr. Klauber can talk about this much better than I can. Not soon after these events, and not even 10 years later, there's the Bartholomew's Day massacre. So France never experienced the reform that other countries did, and so politically, the colloquy was a failure. Theologically, I would say it was a great victory. Because it was a turning point in some ways for the underground French Reformed Church and for the Francophone churches outside of France in solidifying their view of the supper primarily and giving them the kind of courage they needed to continue the work of reform.
Excellent. You guys have any comments or questions? I'm going to look through the live stream chat here.
Yeah, you said that Beza's not as well received as you think he should be. Why do you think that is? If he was the most quoted, adored, and there seemed to be enough appreciation of him in the 17th century, when does that appreciation wane?
Yeah,
And why don't we appreciate him more today?
I think that one of the reasons, one of those accidents of history, he didn't write one single book like Calvin's Institutes or like the Babylonian captivity of Luther or Philip Melanchthon's Loci Communes. He didn't write one single book that very persuasively encapsulated his thought. I think that's one point. The other is just some kind of misinformed prejudice that Richard Muller and others have been, working to rectify, that there's some kind of departure from Calvin in the era of the Reformed Orthodox. So if you know anything about Beza, it's probably that he has the tabula praedestinationis, the table of predestination. And because he is seen as the arch supporter of supralapsarianism, it's easy to dismiss Beza as not pastoral, not pious, not concerned about the souls of men and women, boys and girls. But that's not true. He also, although he contributed, his Confession of Faith contributed to the Belgic Confession, to its composition, he was not the author of a catechism in the way that Ursinus and Olevianus were. And he didn't live quite long enough to oppose Arminius stridently, although his students did, right? He trained a whole generation of students.
David, did Beza write regarding the frequency of the supper? That's one question we received in the chat.
Oh, that's a good question. Probably, but I don't know where. In fact, just yesterday, I was looking at his 1598 Annotationes in Novum Testamentum, and I was looking at Acts 2:42, which is, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And I was wondering whether Beza, and I hope to develop this into a paper, I was wondering whether Beza took the fellowship, the breaking of bread, so it's koinonia is the Greek word, the same one that's used in 1 Corinthians 11 and elsewhere, and then teklase, which is breaking. I was wondering if he took those as appositives. You know how
Right.
one noun restates another? Camden, my friend, one noun restates another. So is the fellowship the breaking of bread? Is koinonia, is Beza interpreting Luke there to mean they devoted themselves to the fellowship, so they had coffee and donuts after worship, and then to the breaking of bread and prayer? Or is he treating them as the same? Right.
Yeah.
Because if the fellowship is the breaking of bread, then I think the clear implication is you had better be celebrating the Lord's Supper as often as you meet. So I was really hoping to find that in Beza because it endorses my own view, right? What I found was something a little more restrained. He said the Syriac edition does take it as an appositive. And he says that there's a good argument that can be made for it, but he says he's not ready to restrict it. He's not ready to restrict the two ideas to one another. Now that still doesn't mean, that there's not a good New Testament argument for frequent communion. It just means it can't be built only on Acts 2:42. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Entirely.
Okay.
But I'm looking forward to that paper whenever you finish it, let us know.
Unfortunately, I have to take up Saturday morning doing things like this. So when am I gonna?
Well, maybe we can keep you accountable, so there'll be some benefit to you as well. Maybe we'll see.
I appreciate that.
I don't know, maybe we're psychologizing here, but just for some folks that might be interested on Catherine de Medici, what you may have mentioned this already, and it may be worth repeating, but what do you think her real motivation was in calling such a colloquy? Is it just to get peace? Is it political? Is there anything more than that? You have any thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on this. I may know a little more than some other people, but there are persons who know much more than I do. So I defer to whoever they are. But I think that the motives you mention are the correct ones. And there's also some indication that she was initially very sympathetic to what Beza and Vermigli especially were saying, because Vermigli is a fellow Italian, a fellow Florentine. And it's always a question, to what extent are the political authorities in this era really interested in the theology, or do they just want the trains to run on time? And religion is seriously disrupting the peace of the realm. But for a person like Cardinal Lorraine and Michel de l'Hôpital, they did not want the Protestant representatives getting too close to Catherine and others for obvious reasons, because that would sink their strategy of driving a division between them.
You brothers have any?
Yeah, I think there are really three sides to this in France. You've got the Cardinal of Lorraine is a member of the Guise family who are based in Lorraine. They're the ardent critics of the Protestants. They're the ones that are driving the wars of religion more than anyone else. So that makes sense. I think Catherine at this point is sometimes referred to as a politique, meaning that she wants peace in the realm. What I find interesting about her, what happens in 1572? Because if she's seeking peace in 1561, and she has a role in the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, she's moved her position. Most scholars say that she's the one responsible. Although the house in which Coligny was shot from, apparently he was tying his shoe, and that's why he didn't die when he got shot. But it was owned by the Guise. The house was.
Oh.
And the Duke of Guise led the retinue to kill the admiral. So was it the Guise that were responsible? And then I've heard some people say, and maybe David, you can answer this, Michel de l'Hôpital was really not in the same camp as the Guise, but was more of a moderate. And
right.
There's been some discussion that the reformer were reaching out to Michel de l'Hôpital to see if they could convert him to the Reformed faith. Am I correct on that?
Yes, that's what I've read, that he was even suspected of having crypto-Protestant convictions. So he worked for the Lorraine family, and at one time described Cardinal Lorraine as the hope of France, something like that. But he was not a zealot on the other side, you might say. He was more of a fixer. To put it in Godfather terms, he was whoever Robert Duvall plays. Who is that? I don't remember.
It's Tom
Hagen, consigliere.
That's right. He just wants things to go smoothly, primarily. That's how I read the sources on L'Hôpital.
It's a fascinating figure. That's one of the most fascinating moments. And when Beza gives his speech, you didn't mention his statement that as far as the heaven is from the earth. Why did you leave that out?
Which part did I leave out?
As far as the heavens are from the earth, so far as the body of Christ.
Yeah, well, that's the Christus non magis est in kaina quam in koino. That's he's no more in the supper than he is in the the dust.
That's an interpretation of what he said.
Correct. What I really should have mentioned is at the end of his closing speech, his peroration, you can find, and this is in Baird, you can find Beza's phenomenal statement that if the court decides against the Protestant position, they had better be careful, because the true church is an anvil that has worn out many hammers. So I think that's a beautiful expression of the notion that the church is called by the Lord to suffer. But no matter how much we suffer, we will endure and win in the end. So it was kind of a veiled threat to the court. Stop beating on us, because you're the ones who will be broken. And it was brilliantly expressed.
That's a brilliant metaphor.
Yeah, it won him praise all over Europe.
Could you keep translating Beza for us, David?
That's my goal. Yeah, thanks.
If he's that important, I think we need to read more.
Well, and Marty, you wrote the foreword to this one, the introduction, if I'm not
I
mistaken.
did. Well, I
Yeah.
enjoyed reading your translation, but I think the more we read Beza, even today, the better informed we are about our faith. I think he's an incredibly valuable resource. We read the institutes, and I'm always reading the institutes, but
Yep.
read Beza.
Good word, good
Fine.
word. Verbum sat
love it.
sapienti, a word to the wise is enough.
Love it. David, thanks for joining us, all the way from the great state of Michigan. Wish you the best and keep praying for you, and I'm very thankful for your ministry, your multifaceted ministry. So
you're
thanks
very
also for the
kind.
scholarship and bringing this. This is really a treat today and a joy to speak it with you. Hopefully you can hang on a little bit, but we're gonna take a break for lunch. We'll be back in roughly an hour on YouTube. Thanks for everyone's patience as we get the live stream links and all that stuff. So we're the easiest way now, if you're wondering where we're going to be, I'm embedding the current live stream on the website at reformedforum.org/francophone is the easiest way to get that, but you can also find it on our YouTube page. So this is just the way things are, but we're thankful it is working and we're getting the material out there. And this was really exciting. So I've got more books on my reading list, thanks to you, David, thanks to you, Marty, Dan, and we're looking forward to 2 more sessions this afternoon. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to end the stream now, and we hope to see you this afternoon. Stop.